never built a company before. I'm 24 years old. Certainly often feel like I'm in over my head.
I don't know what I'm doing, and it makes me extremely nervous.
What keeps me up the most is like, am I really, as a person, capable of building this company?
You so badly wish that I wasn't working at a startup right now. 100%. Do you think that people should do what makes them happy? No.
The risk of failure is so high that there's a good chance that I'm investing years of my life in things that will ultimately fail.
To start a company, you have to be crazy.
None of us had any experience.
I might have taken on more than I can handle.
I work 18, 20-hour days.
I fail multiple times a day.
We live out of a motel.
Hello? We only had 3 weeks of money left.
Just about everything you can imagine went wrong. We made 18,000 pounds of bad product.
Oh my God. If we don't have a product, we don't have a company.
We're in this. Like, we jumped off the cliff. Like, there's no going back. So, like, I have to do it or die trying.
For me, it always comes back to you have to play the game to change it.
90-something% of startups fail. I'm just gonna make it my #1 priority not to.
Have you heard of Bonza?
Really good.
When you buy 3, you get hugs.
Oh, thank you so much.
Being a startup founder is about building something and getting somewhere.
You should fix your hair right away.
I guess it's better.
You start to realize everything is going to seem terrifying, but you'll figure it out one step at a time.
There's no ceiling. There's always more room to grow and more room to achieve.
It's surprised me what being passionate about something can change a gear within myself or anybody else, really.
I definitely did not see any of this coming.
Guys, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
There it is. No. So one of the things that I really liked about this film is I think that when we think about the sort of starving creative, we always think of the starving artist that's sort of been put in our head, the starving painter, the starving filmmaker, or musician. We rarely think about the starving person who's trying to start a company and sort of redefine an actual industry. Was that something that interested you or noticed you about, or you noticed while you were making this film about these characters that you chose?
I think what attracted me to the story, and Cynthia can speak as well to this, is we were really inspired by young people who were moving far outside their comfort zone, who were taking risks, and who were starving for to build something and to do something meaningful. So starving in that sense. They did, some of them starve along the way too, because when we started filming Castle, the Castle guys were living in a house that had no running water and no kitchen, and I think they were living on cereal.
Right, and it's like almost alluded to at one point that the Bonza guys are living on their own pasta as well. So I mean, everybody's sort of putting everything aside in order to try to make these companies work. How did you find your subjects?
Well, Cheryl's son went to a program called Venture for America, which is a program that takes recent college grads and trains them, and then they go to cities, 17 cities around the country, and they work at startups or create their own startups. And she realized it would make a great documentary, approached Venture for America, approached me, raised the money, and then we followed the graduates in Detroit for 17 months.
Were you surprised that it was going to be Detroit?
Venture for America is in, they place recent college graduates in 17 cities across the country. So the fellows work at startups for 2 years. They learn what it takes to launch a company, and then Venture for America encourages them to launch their own companies. So when we raised the funding to make the film, the question became which of these 17 cities were we going to film in? And Cynthia and I made a decision to follow fellows in Detroit.
Why is that?
I mean, Detroit is, they have a slogan in Detroit, Detroit hustles harder, and it's true. I mean, and Labib can talk about this too, because he spent years living there. but that is a city that was built on entrepreneurship and innovation. It's a city that's having a comeback thanks to entrepreneurship and innovation. It's a city, it takes tremendous grit and resilience to launch a company, and that city is all about grit and resilience. There's a tremendous history there. Architecturally, it's a beautiful city. There's just a spirit and determination there that was just palpable.
And I think the idea of Detroit as a city of entrepreneurship has kind of been lost up until the last year, or even until your documentary. Do you want to field that? Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, actually, I ended up marrying somebody whose family was from Detroit, and his family actually ran the uniform business because there were all kinds of jobs in Detroit where people needed to get their uniforms cleaned. And so my relationship with Detroit was the manufacturing industry, and certainly was there for lots of family events, et cetera. So I was really excited, especially in 2014 as Detroit was coming out of bankruptcy, to choose Detroit as the city. Also, there were lots of really interesting things happening with the fellows in the city, from tech to pasta. So it made for a rich filming environment.
Labib, I want to open it up to you. Your story in the documentary is, I think, much more personal than the stories of the other entrepreneurs, because you are not only just sort of redefining who you are as an employer or as someone who's going to be an employee, but you are also sort of redefining your identity as well in respect to your family life. Can you talk about what it was like to sort of be a part of this process while there was so much change happening with you?
Sure. Until I went to Detroit, until I joined Venture for America, and until I joined a startup, I had spent most of my life doing the things that my parents expected of me. And so choosing to go to Detroit, move far away from my family, choosing to work at a startup, all of those things were both things that I wanted to do because I was interested in technology and because I wanted to work for a young growth company. But there were also things that I wanted to do because I needed the space to figure out what I wanted to do for myself.
Who you were.
And who I am as a person. When most people graduate from college and they come to cities like New York or California, there are predefined things that they can fall into. They have groups of friends that they went to college with. There are scenes that young professionals take part in. And so you can get lost in kind of what everyone else is doing. And in Detroit, because there were so few young people, there were so few people that looked like me or came from the background that I had to decide for myself the things that I was interested in doing, the career that I wanted, instead of hearing about my friends who work at an investment bank or a consulting firm. So one of the most empowering things about the experience was the absence of competition or other things to compare myself to, and instead having to choose and decide for myself what my relationship with my family is going to be, what my career choices are going to be, how I want to interact with the world around me. And Detroit was kind of the perfect place to do that.
It's such a different experience for you that your decisions when it comes to your career run parallel with how it's going to affect your family. Were you ever able to strike a balance?
I was sadly not able to strike a balance. So part of what happened when I moved to Detroit was I realized that I didn't share a lot of the same ways of thinking about life that my parents did. I realized that although my parents are from Bangladesh and they are Muslims and were raised me to be a Muslim, I realized that I didn't share their religious beliefs. They wanted me to take kind of stable corporate jobs, and I realized that I wanted to be part of a more entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so part of being in Detroit was I had hoped to strike a balance once I went there, to find out who I was, and then to be able to come to my parents and say, this is where our common ground is. And even as I tried to find it, and there are some areas that we overlapped, it ultimately was, as I think is the case with many kind of second-generation immigrants in America, there ends up being a very wide gulf between people who came to America from somewhere else and people who were born here. And I struggled, and I continue to struggle to bridge that gap. But it is in Detroit. It's what I discovered I was. So I'd rather be true to myself and, negotiate that distance with my parents than try to be someone that I'm not.
How did you find Detroit fit for these entrepreneurs when they got there and when you started filming them? How did it, because it's not Silicon Valley and that's where everybody expects them to go and where they can sort of mingle and they can socialize with other entrepreneurs, but Detroit is different. Were you surprised by how much was available to them there, or was there less available than you thought there'd be?
Again, I think Labib can speak to that from being on the inside. But I think that if you go to Silicon Valley or come to New York or Boston where there's a lot happening, I think it's easy to constantly be comparing yourself to the other startups and feel bad. Or feel
small fish, big pond.
Exactly. Very much so. And I think in Detroit there's so much going on, and there are tremendous opportunities to find support for what you're doing. And I think also there are so fewer distractions. I think people are all about put your head down and work hard and build something. But again, Labib lived it day in and day out. I think that, when it comes to, Castle ended up being a Y Combinator company and ended up raising $2 million in Silicon Valley. I think it's easy to get startups going in Detroit. I don't know if it's easy to find big capital and
to sort of maintain them as they grow.
Well, to scale, to grow in a bigger way. But again, Labib experienced it firsthand and could probably speak to that. But I do think that Detroit, there are tremendous opportunities to create something and build something in that city now.
Mm-hmm. Also, just the community is so supportive. It's a small community, so everybody is super supportive. Anytime you need somebody to reach out, to connect, everybody knows everybody.
Right.
Also, there's something to be said for bad weather, because when it's that cold and that dark half of the year, you hunker down and you work. You're industrious and you work.
Labib, can you attest to that?
Yeah, I can. The crazy thing is, it's not just the bad weather. It's everything closes in Detroit around 7 or 8 p.m. So, unless your social activities are exclusively revolve around establishments that are open past that and revolve around lots of drinking, if you want to actually do anything, you kind of have to ask yourself what it is that you want to do. You have to go and make that activity for yourself. And if that activity is, building companies or working on ideas, Detroit has no distractions. There's nothing to take you away from choosing to pursue those things. So if you go into Detroit knowing that you want to do something and you have a pretty good idea of what that is, it's kind of a fantastic place to go and do that. The cost of living are so low, there are no distractions. You won't really feel guilty about being at home at 10 p.m. on a Friday night because there's not a lot else sometimes going on, especially in the winter.
I do think that's changing. I do think that is changing.
That is changing. That is changing. And conversely, if you do want to interact with the nightlife, that's definitely an option. But there's less of a fear of missing out than there would be if you were, to live in the Village or somewhere in Brooklyn. On the other hand, though, if you go in as someone without a lot of experience and you don't have a lot of ideas and you're looking for inspiration from the people around you and you're not necessarily self-starting and you need a lot of guidance and support, Detroit is probably not the best place for someone in that situation. It definitely requires people to know what they want and be willing to work for it. You're not going to be around people who are in coffee shops constantly talking about their startup ideas and asking you to join in on them or talking about those things. You have to really want to seek it out yourself. And if you're not capable of that, then it's not the best entrepreneurial ecosystem. Conversely, if you go to Silicon Valley, if you're an engineer, chances are someone's going to pitch you on working on their startup, at least once a week. So it depends. Essentially, it's what kind of person you are should define what entrepreneurial ecosystem you want to be a part of. If you're largely self-driven and you don't need a lot of creature comforts to be an entrepreneur, then you should probably go to Detroit. But if you thrive and build on the energy of people around you and you need a lot of external motivators and influence, then one of the larger cities might be a better fit.
I'm curious, as filmmakers, Cynthia and Cheryl, if you related to what entrepreneurs have to do to raise money for their companies, considering how much money you have to raise to make a movie. You have an idea, you go to people who will invest. Did you relate to their stories in that capacity?
I mean, I related tremendously to their stories, and that's what drew me to making this film. I had been second in command at several large companies in my career, and it took me 3 decades to get up the guts, the courage to go out on my own. And I embarked on this film 6 months after I launched my own production company, and I identified so strongly with all of the characters in the movie. I really admired that they were taking risks, moving outside their comfort zone so young, and now that I've done it and it's become second nature, I regret that I didn't do it earlier and younger. So I very much identified. And making this film was, I mean, the making of this film, and we almost ran out of money along the way, and just like so many unexpected things that happened. I identified it every step of the way with every one of their stories. And for me, it was a huge personal growth to make this movie.
Can I ask what gave you the courage to step out on your own when you did?
I got to a point in life where I had made a lot of programming that I loved, but I was also making programming that I didn't love, and I wanted to be master of my destiny. I didn't want a few decades later to look back and think with regret that I hadn't taken a step I stepped out on my own because I got to a point in life where I really only wanted to make programming that I was excited about, I was inspired by, that I felt viewers would be inspired by, and it was basically now or never. And what held me back all along was basically a fear of failing, and I think that's what holds most people back from doing, something, like our characters do in the movie.
Do you want to speak to the relationship between...
Well, there's a scene in the film where one of our entrepreneurs goes to the bank account. There's almost no money, and I've been there so many times as an independent filmmaker, so yeah.
I very much related to that scene as well. Yeah. Why am I doing these things? I have very little money right now. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. Who has questions out there?
Hello. Since the film is about young entrepreneurs, I was just curious to know if you guys had an opinion on the way young people and millennials are perceived nowadays, since the perception is that we're lazy and not hardworking, and how could a young millennial kind of break out of that stereotype?
Can I say one thing about that? Sorry, I'm going to let you answer the question. Every generation views the generation after them as lazy, and like any generation, hippies were viewed a certain way, yuppies were viewed a certain way, boomers were viewed a certain way. Everyone older always looks at people younger and goes, "You're lazy and you suck," because they're bored and they're old. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
That's funny. I don't think of millennials as lazy at all, and I think it's horrible to gross generalization of any generation. One thing that is really surprising to people is that millennials are the least entrepreneurial generation in many decades. Entrepreneurship is at a 25-year low among 18 to 34-year-olds. Part of that has to do with just pragmatic things like student debt and inability to have access to capital. But also, there have been a number of studies done, and 40% of 18 to 30-year-olds say that what's holding them back is fear of failing. So I don't think of millennials as lazy, but I don't know, if you two have thoughts about that.
Labib, are you lazy?
I was a little surprised too. I've seen the media conversation around millennials are lazy, but it's maybe it's the company that I keep or the worlds that I live in. I have never encountered that perception. There are things like, they don't show up to work on time, or they're more lax with their scheduling. Like they think it's okay to come in at 10 a.m. as opposed to 9. But I don't think there's a general perception that when we are working on the task that has been given to us, that we don't do it really well or effectively or work hard at it. So I don't really have a good answer to your question because I don't experience a widespread perception that millennials are lazy. They are, they seek more of their own comfort. They can sometimes do frivolous things, or at least do them more publicly than previous generations have. But I don't really experience the stereotype that millennials are a particularly lazy bunch.
But also millennials are, at this point 23, 25 years old. When they're 35, they might not show up late. They might not do certain things to be like, oh, that generation does it. It's like, no, 23-year-olds do that sometimes. It's not necessarily that like this entire generation is going to be the same forever. Sorry, I stepped on you.
No, I agree with you. Well, I also think that if you see this film, you will not come away thinking millennials are lazy. I mean, every one of the characters in this movie, they work around the clock. And I think that that's basically, if you want to do anything significant or build anything, it really takes really hard work. I think that there's this romanticized view of entrepreneurship, and we definitely burst that bubble in this movie because we are there with them for a year and a half and capturing how hard it is and how hard you have to work, but also with the message that if you work really hard and you persevere, you have a good chance, a good shot at success, because I think that that is the difference oftentimes between success and failure, is those who stick with it and persevere and are determined and work really hard. So I think that anyone who thinks millennials are lazy after seeing this film will come away with a very different impression.
I think boomers are the lazy generation, sorry. The electric can opener generation, that's the lazy generation. Next question.
Hey all, good afternoon. The documentary really hits a chord with me. I'm also a person that works around the clock to make myself something. So my question is for Labib. When you were filming the documentary, what were particular challenges and obstacles that you faced that you could potentially give advice to other people to maybe be on the lookout for if they want to go out on their own and do their thing?
I think the most important thing that I took from my time in Detroit is that the people that you choose to work with will have the single greatest impact of your experience. Like, more than your ability to raise money, more than how good your product is, who you choose to team up with will completely define how you feel coming out of the experience, regardless of success or failure. And I think that younger people can sometimes be a trusting bunch. And so people can come up to them and create this impression of who they are and sell them on this dream. And then you can jump in and realize, this person isn't all they said they would be, and everything that they promised to you may not be exactly as it seems. And so the single most important thing I can say is, be very, very careful before making a decision to work with someone, whether as a co-founder or a partner in a project or someone who's your boss. It will define more of your day-to-day happiness than anything else.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hey guys, my brother's been doing the startup thing for like 3 years now from home, and not only has he not made money, he hasn't really spoken to anyone. So I wondered, did you guys face the aspect of like crippling isolation in entrepreneurship?
I experienced that to a kind of pretty profound degree. I grew up in New York, and Detroit is a very different place than New York. It's a very white and black city. There aren't a lot of people in Detroit who look like me. So I experienced a lot of isolation just from demographic changes. Like, I would walk out, go to work, and I would spend an entire week without seeing someone who looks like me and thinking, oh, this person kind of knows the world that I live in. So that's one thing. The second thing is the hours are strange. The thing that you're doing is unfamiliar to most people. Technology is still, something that many people struggle to understand or want to. And so, yeah, there's a lot of isolation in terms of feeling like people don't really understand what you're doing, in terms of being physically isolated because you're working at night and other people just aren't. The only thing that I can suggest that you do, and the thing that Venture for America did for me, was put me in an environment where there were other people who were doing the same thing. Not a lot, not to the point where I was surrounded by them every day, but enough so that once a month or twice a month I could reach out to them and say, hey, I'm really struggling. Can we just meet and talk about it, and you can just, have an hour-long conversation basically explaining all the ways that you feel alone, and they'll just listen, and that matters. So for your brother who's been working from home for 3 years, the best thing I can say is to find at least one other person who understands what he's living through.
I think mentorship is really important. A lot of entrepreneurs talk about the importance of mentorship and finding others to guide them, and also community. And I know whenever I undertake something that's a big challenge that I've never done before, I need support. I need support from friends, from family, from other people who have done it. So I think it would be really healthy for him to find support through any ways, and also guidance.
How can people see Generation Startup?
Generation Startup opens at the IFC Center on Friday. We open at the Monica Lemley in Los Angeles on September 30th, and we open in Detroit at the Detroit Institute of Arts on October 7th. So spread the word, and the people find the film very inspirational, very powerful, so we'd love everyone to come out and see it.
Absolutely. Congratulations. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.